targeted Palestine as the only possible space for satisfying these two needs, the need to be secure and the need to have self-determination, the moment these two needs were attached geographically to the land of Palestine, Zionism became a colonialist project. And the fact that Zionism was in its early beginning a colonialist project is a very relevant historical fact for understanding the conflict today and the chances of solving it. Alas, all the peace efforts from 1948 and even more so since 1967 totally ignore the colonialist nature of Zionism at its very beginning and the colonialist nature of the State of Israel today. And colonialism has to be treated not so much as an emotional issue to which you have a negative or a positive attitude, but as a fact of life. It brings with it attitudes, policies, red lines, convictions, and if you don't decolonize the reality that Zionism created in 1882, you will not have peace and reconciliation in Palestine. And as long as the situation stays in Israel and Palestine as it is, the colonialist reality continues. After arriving, first exercise I have in this trip. After arriving in Palestine in the late 19th century, the Zionist leadership was not too much preoccupied with the question of what should it do with the local population, with the native population of Palestine. Because it was a small community of settlers, it was preoccupied with other issues, which indirectly affected the Palestinians, but not directly, such as the question of how to build an infrastructure for a future independent state, how to encourage Jewish immigration into the land, how to purchase land, what should be the relationship with the powers that be at the time, and so on. So I would say that until the 1930s, Zionism was not troubled too much by the fact that it found a land with people, for the people without land, but much more with its own role in the land. Now, this has all changed in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, Zionism began to be formulated in a way that is again relevant to what goes on today in Israel and Palestine, and is relevant to the chances of peace and reconciliation. The hardcore of Zionist leadership in the late 1930s, because of the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, because of the fact that the settlers became already 1/3 of the population on the ground, and because of the beginning of the Palestinian awareness and the strong resistance to the presence of Zionism, because of all these facts, Zionism, or the Zionist leadership, began to build a clearer, I would say, vision and ideology that focused, among other things, on the fate of the Palestinians. I should hasten and say that Zionism dealt also with other issues, and that's why it's so difficult today to enlist and recruit people to struggle against the discrimination of the Palestinians, the oppression of the Palestinians, and the dispossession of the Palestinians. Because Zionism brought with it a lot of positive features to the Jews who came to Palestine. I know I'm a product, be it probably a flawed product of the Zionist production line, but nonetheless I'm very familiar with the production line. It produces, as you know, it revived the dormant language. It created a haven to people who came from different countries and different ethnic backgrounds, and created basically good life for many people who didn't have such good life before, not to mention given them really sanctuary at the time that Nazism and fascism raged in Europe and other countries in the world, including Canada, closed the doors for Jewish immigration out of Holocaust Europe. So this is the part of Zionism that I'm not interested in tonight. What I'm interested in something that became a Zionist obsession, the fate of the Palestinians on the land of Palestine. And in the 1930s, the Palestinians were still 2/3 of the population. And the Zionists were mostly people who came there 2, 3, or 4 years earlier. Very few of them were there for a longer time. And when they thought about that local population, they developed a two-dimensional attitude towards them. One dealt with space or geography. And the Zionist leadership became convinced that in order to fulfill the Zionist ideal of a Jewish state, you need to control as much of Palestine as possible. Preferably the whole of mandatory Palestine, or historical Palestine. If not possible, at least most of it. This dimension, I don't have to tell you, is still relevant to Israeli policies ever since 1948 and until today. And the wish to have full control over what is Palestine is far more important to most Israeli politicians than any other wish, including the wish to reconcile with the Palestinians or to negotiate a peace treaty with the Arab countries. It's very important to understand. This is not a right-wing position in Israel. This is a consensus Zionist position. You have to, in order to survive, you need the land which is yours. This is not a Zionist invention, by the way. National romantic movements in Europe, such as the Italian and the German ones, had already developed this idea that if a nation wants to excel, it has to possess its ancient homeland. And in this respect, Zionism is not an exception. The second dimension is the dimension of demography, of population. It's not enough to have your so-called ancient homeland. You need to have an exclusive demographic presence in it. Again, preferably, there should be no one there who is not a Jew. If it's impossible, the non-Jews, especially those Palestinians, should be a very small, insignificant minority. And this is again connected to this national romantics ideas that a nation cannot thrive, cannot progress if it doesn't have such total demographic control. And again, as in the case of space, so in the case of demographic supremacy, this is the supreme value of what euphemistically is called in your press the only democracy in the Middle East. No democracy in the world can have such a racist ideology, still be called a democracy, apart from one state, the state of Israel. The next relevant station in this historical journey are the late 1940s. Again, due to historical developments that I don't have time to develop, the Zionist leadership could not be content anymore with visions and ideologies. They had to translate these fluid ideas, these abstract notions, into strategies and policies on the ground. And it was especially in the last years of the British Mandate, 1946, 1947, that the Zionist leadership began to prepare what I called in my last book, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, the ethnic cleansing is not a pejorative term one uses just in order to condemn someone. It's a very clear-cut legal, political, and moral term. It has today vast theoretical literature. And if you look at the way that Zionist ideology and policy towards the Palestinians developed from 1946 to the end of 1948, you cannot think of any other classical example of ethnic cleansing than the one that occurred in Palestine. As I show in my book, one of the best sources, to my mind, for finding theoretical and general description of what ethnic cleansing is all about is the website of the American State Department. They have a very clear description there, and in many ways it was easy to write the book I've written in the last stages, because it was such a structured and well-analyzed way of presenting the case of ethnic cleansing, and all I had to do was fit what they had there to the history of Palestine in the relevant years. And I think the most crucial moment was when Britain decided it had enough of Palestine. The British government decided to leave Palestine in the very beginning of February 1947. And at that very moment, a small number of Zionist leaders began to prepare a very clear plan to depopulate Palestine, to expel the Palestinians from their homeland. The intention was to uproot every Palestinian. For different reasons, which I developed in my book, they did not succeed in doing that, but they have achieved quite a lot.